This is a story about the kind of betrayal you can't see coming, the kind that cuts deeper than any razor. It's a story about a little girl who always did what was expected of her, and the woman who finally decided to stop. If you've ever had a relationship that you knew was hard, but you just couldn't break free, then you know this feeling. And if this sounds like something you'd like to hear, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and a comment. It truly means the world to me and helps these stories reach more wonderful people like you. The night before my wedding, I fell asleep, a woman filled with hope and a future so bright, it almost blinded me. I woke up a scared, humiliated child with a cold, smooth scalp. I'm Amelia, I'm 29, and until that night, I thought my life was finally going to be my own. My fiancé, Liam, was a dream. He was kind, patient, and completely blind to the red flags I had been trained to ignore my whole life. My parents, Eleanor and George, had always seen me as their best investment. I was a straight-A student. I got a great job as a pediatric nurse, and I always gave them a cut of my paycheck. My wedding was supposed to be my big escape, my final act of freedom. I went to bed that night, dreaming of my beautiful dress and the man I was going to marry, not knowing that my parents had a different kind of ceremony planned for me. Earlier that evening, my mother, Eleanor, had come into my room with a small crystal glass of champagne. She wasn't one for spontaneous affection, so her sudden cheerfulness caught me by surprise. "To my little girl," she'd said, raising her glass, "the last night of your freedom." It was a strange toast, but I was too happy to question it. I'd taken a long sip, feeling the familiar fizz of the champagne, but as I finished the glass, a strange dizziness washed over me, a feeling like I was floating away. My last memory was of my mother's face, smiling, but with a coldness in her eyes I had never noticed before, and my father standing silently in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the floor. I thought it was just the excitement getting to me. I had no idea it was the beginning of my nightmare. My mother, Eleanor, was always a woman of grand gestures and even grander expectations. She believed that life was a series of transactions and that a person's worth was measured by what they could provide. I was her prize horse, a thoroughbred she had carefully groomed to be her financial security in her old age. She'd always managed to make me feel like I owed them everything, for my education, my home, for the very air I breathed. The house was a museum of her triumphs. My trophies and framed diplomas were less a tribute to my hard work and more a testament to her excellent management. When I met Liam, I was just happy that someone saw me for me, not as a reflection of my parents' perfect creation. He came from a solid old money family, the kind where they didn't talk about money, they just had it. My parents, on the other hand, were always counting their pennies, even when they didn't need to, and they were furious that Liam and his family were too wealthy for them to manipulate. The wedding wasn't just a union for them, it was a hostile takeover. They saw me marrying him as a loss of their retirement fund, a betrayal of my duties as their daughter. They had been trying to sabotage the wedding for months, but their efforts were subtle, like a tiny crack in a glass that you only notice when it shatters. This was the night the glass shattered, and my life with it. I had no idea that they had already been spreading rumors to my future in-laws, making me out to be a demanding bride with extravagant tastes, someone who was not worthy of their son. They'd been poisoning the well for a long time, and I was too naive to even know it. The morning sun, usually a cheerful companion, was a cruel spotlight, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. I didn't feel the chill of the air on my skin right away. I just felt a strange lightheadedness. My head felt heavy, but also wrong. My fingers went to my scalp, and instead of the usual thick waves of my hair, they met a smooth, shocking surface. I ran my hands over my head, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't smooth all over. There was a small, twisted patch of my hair, left like a grotesque signature on the pillow beside me. It was a lock of my own dark, beautiful hair, a piece of me they had so carelessly discarded. The room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. My heart began to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs. The realization of what had happened hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just sabotaged my wedding, they had violated me, stripped me of my identity, and stolen my dignity. I stumbled out of bed, catching my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, her eyes wide with terror, her head a pale, shocking canvas. Tears welled in my eyes, but they were quickly replaced by a cold, burning rage. They had done this to me, my own parents. The people who were supposed to protect me had done this to me, and for what? The answer came to me with a bitter certainty. My parents' main motivation was financial. They were furious that Liam and his family were too wealthy for them to manipulate. They couldn't ask for a new car, a larger house, or a trip to Europe. My marriage to Liam was a declaration of my independence, a step toward a life where I wouldn't be their personal ATM. They saw my happy ending as a loss of their retirement fund. My mother, Eleanor, had always had an uncanny ability to turn everything into a business transaction. My achievements were her profit, and my happiness was a currency she couldn't control. The wedding wasn't just a union for them, it was a hostile takeover they couldn't win, so they decided to burn the whole place down. I looked around the room, feeling the walls close in on me. My phone was gone, my keys were gone, even the little emergency stash of cash I kept hidden in a book was gone. They had thought of everything. They had disarmed me, making sure I couldn't call for help, couldn't run, couldn't do anything but sit there and be a victim. But they had underestimated me. They had no idea that their cruel act of humiliation was about to become the very thing that set me free. The door creaked open, a slow, agonizing sound that seemed to stretch the seconds into a painful eternity. My mother, Eleanor, stood framed in the doorway, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Unlike me, who felt like a broken, discarded doll, she looked completely at ease. She was wearing a perfectly pressed silk robe, her hair a flawless coiffure, and her expression was one of almost serene satisfaction. She didn't gasp, didn't recoil, didn't show an ounce of remorse. She simply stepped inside, a quiet predator entering the scene of her latest kill. The room, which had been filled with my silent sobs, now felt like a stage set for a terrible performance, and I was the humiliated star. "There you are, my dear," she said, her voice soft and saccharine, the tone of a woman talking to a child who had just had a bad dream. "You look so peaceful." The word peaceful landed on me like a ton of bricks. There was nothing peaceful about this. This was a nightmare. This was a violation. I clutched the sheets, trying to cover my bare scalp, to hide from the cold judgment in her eyes. But she just kept smiling, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which were as cold and sharp as shards of glass. My father, George, stood a few paces behind her, looking not at me, but at his own hands, wringing them together as if trying to wash them clean of a guilt he refused to acknowledge. He was always a quiet man, a man who chose a peaceful life over a moral one, and in that moment his silence was louder than any scream. Eleanor walked slowly towards me, and every step she took felt like an insult. "What did you do?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice raw and broken. Her smile widened, but it held no warmth. "I did what any good mother would do, Amelia. I saved you." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Saved me. She hadn't saved me. She had destroyed me. She went on, her voice a calm, logical flow of twisted reasoning. "You were throwing your life away. Liam and his family, they were simply too much. They're a different breed of people, a different class. You would have been miserable, a failure." She gestured to the room, to the remnants of my hair on the pillow. "You see, they would have expected you to be perfect. And you are, my dear, but not in their way. You are a simple girl, a quiet girl. Their world would have eaten you alive." She spoke as if I were a delicate flower she had plucked from a harsh garden. But she hadn't plucked me. She had torn me up by the roots. I felt a surge of rage so powerful it almost made me forget my humiliation. "You don't know me," I said, my voice rising. "I am a person, not a project. I chose him." Eleanor simply laughed, a light, tinkling sound that was more chilling than a yell. Choose? Oh, Amelia, there is no choosing. There is only what is best for you, and I, your mother, know what that is. This marriage was never a partnership. It was a hostile takeover. They would have taken you from me, taken you from your home, from your family. They would have made you a trophy, and I would have been left with nothing. I've invested years in you, built you up. Do you think I would just let you walk away to be some rich man's little prize, with nothing to show for it? Her words confirmed my deepest, darkest suspicion. This wasn't about my happiness. It was about her losing control, losing her most valuable asset. The saving was just a convenient excuse for a cruel, selfish act of preservation. She was like a desperate queen burning her own castle to stop an invading army. A crazy thought, but not far from the truth. She had always viewed our relationship as a financial transaction. I was her cash cow, her retirement fund, her safety net, and Liam was threatening all of that. I looked at my father, begging him with my eyes to say something, to do something, to show a flicker of the man who used to teach me how to ride a bike, but he just kept his head down, his shoulders slumped. He was a non-entity, a ghost in his own life, and he had been for as long as I could remember. "We have already been in touch with them," Eleanor said, a cold smile on her lips. "I told them you were feeling ill, that you'd had a breakdown. I've sent a text to Liam's mother explaining that the wedding is postponed indefinitely. The guests have been informed. No one will be coming here today. There is no wedding." She pulled out her phone and held it up, showing me the confirmation message. The words were a knife twisting in my gut. My stomach churned with despair and my mind raced with a million panicked questions. How could I ever prove this? How could I explain this? The situation was utterly hopeless, a perfect trap of their making. I was a bird with clipped wings in a cage with the door locked from the outside. She had won, for now. The cold silence that followed my mother's words was more deafening than any scream. She stood there, a vision of composure and victory, while I sat on the bed, a monument to her cruelty. The smugness on her face was almost unbearable. My father, still refusing to meet my eyes, finally shuffled out of the room. He was a silent accomplice, a man who had chosen to be a coward his entire life, and in that moment, I felt a new kind of contempt for him, a cold disdain that settled deep in my bones. It was one thing for my mother to be a monster. It was another for my father to have been a willing spectator. Left alone, the reality of my situation finally sank in. They had taken my phone, my keys, even my wedding dress. I scrambled off the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor, and began a frantic search. The room was small, but every corner held a new wave of despair. The closet was empty, save for a few old hangers. The drawers were pulled out, my clothes gone. I even lifted the mattress, a desperate, futile act. But there was nothing. They had stripped the room of anything I could use, anything that could connect me to the outside world. They hadn't just sabotaged my wedding. They had built a fortress around me, with themselves as the only guards. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, any way out. What if I screamed? What if I broke a window? What if I just ran out of the house? My mother had been so calm, so sure of herself. She must have known I would try to fight, and she had already planned for it. I ran to the window and looked out. The house was a good 100 yards from the street, and my mother had already moved her car to block the driveway. Even if I could make it to the main road, what then? Who would believe me? Who would believe a bald, hysterical woman running down the street in her pajamas, claiming her own parents had drugged and humiliated her? The despair was a suffocating weight on my chest. I fell to the floor, the cold tiles a shocking contrast to the burning humiliation in my heart. This was rock bottom. I had always been the good daughter, the one who worked hard, the one who gave back, the one who made them proud. I had believed that if I was just good enough, they would eventually love me for me, but I was wrong. I was just a possession, a prize to be won and, if necessary, to be destroyed to prevent someone else from winning it. I crawled to the mirror again and stared at my reflection. The girl who had gone to bed last night was gone, replaced by a stranger. My beautiful hair, a part of my identity since I was a child, was gone. It felt like a part of my soul had been shaved away with it. This wasn't just a cruel prank, it was a punishment. A punishment for wanting my own life, for daring to be happy, for loving someone they couldn't control. They were so afraid of losing me that they chose to break me instead. I thought of Liam, of his kind eyes and gentle smile, of the way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. He was waiting for me. He was probably at the venue right now, getting ready for our perfect day, completely unaware that his bride was trapped in a gilded cage. He must be so confused, so worried. My mother's text message would have been enough for his family, but Liam would know something was wrong. But what could he do? They had me completely cut off. The contrast between this dark, isolated moment and the bustling, joyous wedding preparations happening just a few miles away was a torment I couldn't escape. It was a hell of their own making, and I was trapped in the center of it, alone and completely powerless. But even in the deepest despair, a flicker of something new began to stir within me. Not hope, not yet, just a cold, hard resolve. They had taken everything from me, but they couldn't take my mind. And in that desperate moment, a small, insignificant detail from the day before, a memory I had completely forgotten, began to surface. The cold, hard resolve that had been my only companion in that dark room began to thaw, replaced by a tiny, flickering spark of hope. My mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic and despair, suddenly found a focal point. It was a single, seemingly insignificant memory from the day before, a detail I had forgotten in the haze of my drugged stupor. My father, in a moment of unusual anxiety, had dropped his car keys and a small, folded piece of paper. He'd apologized profusely, scrambling to pick them up, his hands shaking slightly. I hadn't thought much of it then, chalking it up to pre-wedding jitters. But now, in the stillness of my confinement, that memory came back to me with a sudden, vivid clarity. The piece of paper wasn't just a scrap. It was a receipt from a pharmacy, and on the back, in my father's hurried handwriting, was a short, scribbled note. Pay storage unit. I had no idea where the pharmacy was or what the receipt was for, but the storage unit. That was a name I knew. My parents had a storage unit. They had always been secretive about it, a place of mystery and hushed conversations. My mother would say it was just for old family heirlooms, but she never let me or anyone else go near it. My curiosity had always been a nuisance to her, and she would shut down any questions about it with a cold stare. I had always assumed it held boring, dusty, old furniture. But what if it didn't? What if it held something more? The receipt for the medication, paired with the scribbled note, seemed to connect two worlds I never thought existed. It was my what if moment. What if that storage unit was more than just a place for old things? What if it held something that could explain their behavior, something they were trying to hide? This one small detail, this tiny thread of a clue, was enough to stop my tears. I stood up, my mind now clear and focused. They had taken my phone, my keys, my clothes, everything. But they hadn't taken my brain. I remembered an old, prepaid burner phone I had bought years ago, a silly purchase I'd made in high school with a friend as a joke. I had kept it in an old shoebox in the back of my closet, and I was sure they wouldn't have thought to look there. After a frantic search, I found it, a small black rectangle that felt like a lifeline. I prayed it was charged. The screen flickered to life, and a wave of relief washed over me. I had a connection. I couldn't call the police. My parents would just lie, and who would believe me, this disheveled, bald woman? I couldn't call Liam and just tell him. He would rush here, get into a fight with my parents, and the whole thing would turn into a screaming match with no one believing my side of the story. I needed proof. My mind, trained by years of watching true crime documentaries with my grandmother, began to think like a detective. I needed an ally, someone who wasn't involved, someone who could act quickly and quietly. The first person who came to mind was my childhood friend, Sarah. She lived just a few towns over and was the only person who knew about my parents' controlling nature, though she had no idea how deep it went. I called her, my voice trembling. "Sarah," I whispered into the phone. "I need your help. I can't explain everything, but I need you to go to my parents' storage unit. It's on a little side road just off the main highway, near the old bowling alley. The key is hidden in the fake rock next to the back door." She knew I wouldn't ask for help unless it was an absolute emergency. She didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice a calm anchor in my storm of panic. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The plan was in motion. This wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about proving to the world what my parents had done. It was about exposing their cruelty and their lies, and that storage unit was the key to my freedom. I was a coiled spring, a living bundle of nerves. Time, which had moved at a sluggish, agonizing pace a moment ago, was now frozen. My phone felt like a rock in my hand, its silence louder than a scream. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and my mind was a churning chaos of what-if scenarios. What if Sarah didn't find the key? What if my parents had moved the unit? What if they got back before she did? I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait. I needed to act. My mind, still in detective mode, turned to the other thing my mother kept locked away, an old family photo album. She had always kept it hidden in a small, locked box in her closet, and my curiosity had been a constant source of friction between us. My mother would say it held sentimental trinkets from my grandmother, but her refusal to ever show me suggested something more. Now that box felt like a siren call, a beacon to a hidden past. My hands trembled as I carefully picked the lock with a bobby pin I had tucked into my pajama pocket. The small click was a victory, a tiny act of rebellion that filled me with a surge of cold, determined adrenaline. Inside, the box was not filled with trinkets. It held only two things: the photo album and a thin, worn leather journal. I opened the album first. The photos were old, their colors faded to sepia tones, but the faces were instantly recognizable. There was my grandfather, a stoic man with a stern expression, and next to him, a younger version of my mother, her face already showing the hard lines of her future self. And then there was my grandmother, a woman I barely knew, who had passed away when I was a child. The shock of seeing her was immediate. She looked exactly like me, the same eyes, the same nose, the same gentle smile that I saw in my own reflection. But as I looked closer, my heart sank into my stomach. In every photo, my grandmother wore a wide, elegant hat or a perfectly styled wig. In one picture, a gust of wind had caught her hat, and for a fleeting moment, I could see a flash of her scalp, a shocking, pale baldness underneath. I flipped through the pages frantically, my breath catching in my throat. In every single picture, in every moment of supposed joy, my grandmother was hiding. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a pattern. This was a hidden truth that had been passed down like a family heirloom. Tears welled in my eyes as I picked up the journal. The leather was soft with age, and the pages were filled with my grandmother's delicate handwriting. I began to read, and as I did, my world crumbled and reassembled itself in a new, horrifying form. The journal entry described a wedding day, a generation ago. It was her wedding day, and my grandmother wrote about her love for a kind, gentle man. But her parents, my grandparents, had disapproved. The night before the wedding, they had drugged her, just as my parents had drugged me. They had humiliated her, not by shaving her head, but by cutting off a symbolic braid of her hair and presenting it to her groom's family as a sign of her unworthiness. They had told her she was too simple, too plain, too much of a country girl for their sophisticated city life. The journal entries were a long, painful chronicle of a life of quiet despair. My grandmother had never fought back. She had married the man, but the emotional scars had never healed. She had lived her life in a perpetual state of fear and obedience, always a victim. This changed everything. My mother, Eleanor, wasn't just a monster. She was a product of generational trauma. Her cruelty wasn't a random act of malice. It was a perverted echo of her own past, a vicious cycle she had not broken, but had chosen to continue. She had been the victim, and instead of choosing a different path, she had chosen to become the abuser. The reversal was profound and sickening. The villain wasn't a one-dimensional demon. She was a woman who had been so broken by her own parents that she felt the need to inflict the same pain on her own daughter. I realized that my mother wasn't just afraid of losing control of me. She was terrified of losing the power she had so desperately sought after her own humiliation. If you're still with me, thank you. Thank you for listening to my story and for being a part of this journey. Your support, your comments, and your simple presence help me share these stories that might otherwise be lost. It means more to me than words can say. Please consider subscribing and leaving a comment. Now, back to my story. Just as I finished reading the last heartbreaking entry, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "I'm here," it read. A few seconds later, another one came through. "Amelia, you are not going to believe what I just found in here. It's not just old stuff. It's a lot more." My heart jumped into my throat. The quiet, emotional truth I had just uncovered was about to be backed up by cold, hard evidence. I was no longer just a victim of a family tragedy. I was about to become a witness to a crime, and my parents' carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down. The truth, once a flickering candle in the dark, had now become a roaring fire in my mind. The emotional truth of my mother's generational trauma had just been confirmed by the cold, hard, and deeply incriminating evidence Sarah had found. My phone buzzed again, this time with a torrent of pictures and videos. I scrolled through them, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in a dusty, forgotten storage unit, was a treasure trove of my parents' deceit. There were stacks of cash, bundles of money they had meticulously saved, not from their own salaries, but from mine. There were bank statements, too, showing years of transfers from my accounts to theirs, all under the guise of helping me manage my finances. There were also forged documents, including a fake will that made me seem like a greedy, selfish daughter who was trying to steal their inheritance. It was a perfectly constructed web of lies and manipulation. My hands, which had been shaking with despair just moments ago, were now steady with a new, cold resolve. They had taken everything from me, my hair, my dignity, my wedding day. But they had given me something even more powerful, the fuel for my revenge. I couldn't just walk into the wedding and tell my story. No one would believe me. I had to prove it. The plan began to form in my mind, a complicated, multi-layered trap that would turn their own cruelty against them. This wasn't about revenge in a dark corner. This was about public, irrefutable humiliation. I knew the wedding was still going on, but it wasn't a wedding without a bride. My parents had told everyone it was canceled, but that wasn't true. My father had already informed the venue staff that it would be a small, intimate gathering with only a few close friends and family, and the rest of the staff would still be working since they were paid in advance. I had to get there, but I couldn't just walk in looking like I did. I needed to look like a bride. I remembered a beautiful white headscarf I had been given as a gift from my grandmother, the one from the journal. It was my last connection to her. I found it in the small box, folded neatly. It was a simple, elegant piece of silk, and it would be my shield. My next step was to use the burner phone and call a taxi. The old phone's signal was weak, but I managed to get through. I told the dispatcher my location, and as I waited, I quickly put together a video. I took a deep breath, looked into the phone's camera, and in a calm, steady voice, I told my story. I showed my shaven head, the evidence of my parents' betrayal. I narrated the lies they had told and how they had tried to ruin my life and my relationship with Liam. Then I showed the videos and pictures from Sarah's phone, the irrefutable proof of their financial fraud, and the forged documents. I finished the video with a poignant message about breaking the cycle of abuse and finding my own strength. The plan was a high-stakes gamble. a game of emotional poker where I was holding all the aces. I would arrive at the venue, walk down the aisle, and then, at the moment of truth, the video would play. It wouldn't be a sweet tribute to my relationship with Liam. It would be a public exposé of my parents' darkest secrets. It would be a moment of reckoning, a public spectacle that would leave them with nothing to hide. I wasn't just going to get married. I was going to be a living testament to the fact that you can't control someone else's life without losing your own. I knew this was my only chance to regain my dignity, to stand up for myself, and to break the terrible cycle that had trapped my family for generations. My parents had planned for every possibility, every escape, every argument, but they hadn't planned for this. They hadn't planned for me to turn their cruelest act into my greatest weapon. I hung up the phone, a cold, a determined calm settling over me. The old burner phone, a relic of my teenage rebellion, had become my lifeline. I had a taxi on the way, a video ready to expose my parents' deception, and a new sense of purpose that was stronger than any fear or humiliation. Now, I just had to get out of the house without my parents noticing. This was the most nerve-wracking part of my plan. I knew they would be downstairs, probably toasting their victory with a glass of champagne, completely unaware that their victim was no longer a victim. I crept out of the guest room, my feet silent on the carpeted hallway floor. The house was unnervingly quiet. I could hear the faint sound of the television from the living room, a normal, everyday sound that felt deeply unsettling in the context of my nightmare. My stomach churned with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. I had to get out. I just had to. I tiptoed past their room, past the bathroom, past the closet where I knew my beautiful wedding dress was likely hidden, and headed for the back door. It was locked, of course. My mother, with her meticulous attention to detail, had planned for every possible escape. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow, dragging. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was my father. He was coming up the stairs, and he wasn't alone. I could hear the soft clinking of glass on a tray. He was bringing me food, or maybe another celebratory drink. I had to think fast. I ran back to the guest room and jumped into bed, pulling the sheets up to my chin, my body trembling with a mixture of cold and fear. I pretended to be asleep, my breathing slow and even, as if I were in a deep, peaceful slumber. The door creaked open, and my father's shadow fell over me. He stood there for a long time, so long that I almost couldn't hold my breath anymore. I could feel his gaze on me, a heavy, sad weight. He said nothing, but I heard a soft sigh. Then I heard the sound of the glass being placed on the nightstand next to me. I risked a glance. There was a glass of water and a small plate of crackers. He had brought me food. Not a tranquilizer, not more champagne, just a simple glass of water and crackers. It was a tiny, insignificant gesture, but it was the first sign of a crack in their perfect facade. It was a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who had taught me how to ride a bike and had always looked at me with a quiet kindness. I waited until I heard his footsteps recede and the door to their room click shut. Then, I sprang out of bed, grabbed the glass of water and the crackers, and ran to the back door. I looked through the peephole. The coast was clear. I grabbed the spare key my father had left in the fake rock next to the back door, just as I had instructed Sarah to do, and I unlocked it. The old lock clicked open, a sound of sweet, sweet freedom. I ran out into the cool morning air, the sound of a taxi horn a sweet melody in the distance. The taxi pulled up to the curb, and I ran to it, my heart pounding in my chest. The driver, a kind, older woman, looked at me with a mixture of shock and concern. "Honey, are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I just shook my head, my eyes welling up with tears. I couldn't explain. "Just take me to the St. Francis Cathedral," I said, my voice trembling. "And please drive fast." She didn't ask any more questions. She just put the car in drive and sped off, my old life a blur in the rearview mirror. This was it. There was no turning back now. The taxi pulled up to the St. Francis Cathedral, and my heart felt like it was going to beat right out of my chest. I paid the kind driver, gave her an extra $50 for her kindness, and slipped out of the taxi. The world outside felt unreal. The sky was a vibrant blue, the sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sound of cheerful chatter and classical music. It was a wedding day, my wedding day, and my parents, who had told everyone that the wedding was off, were standing at the entrance, greeting the few guests they had invited to what they had called a small family lunch. They were so calm, so composed, so smugly satisfied. They were so sure that they had won. But their smiles vanished the moment they saw me. Their faces drained of all color, turning a pasty white as if they had seen a ghost. They started to stammer, their voices a flurry of panicked whispers. "Amelia, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in bed," my mother hissed, her eyes wide with fear and fury. "We told everyone you had a... you know," she trailed off, her voice cracking. My father, with a flicker of his old self, looked at me with a sad, defeated expression. They both looked like children who had been caught with their hands in the cookie jar. But I didn't stop. I walked past them with my head held high, the white headscarf a beacon of my defiance. The small group of guests turned to look at me, and whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that Amelia? I thought the wedding was canceled. She looks so... different." But I didn't care what they thought. My gaze was fixed on Liam, who was standing at the end of the aisle, a look of confusion and worry on his face. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and a question he couldn't ask. He took a step towards me, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, his love for me was real. The priest, who had been chatting with Liam's parents, turned to face the crowd, and a look of confusion crossed his face. He looked at me, then at my parents, then back at me. I walked down the aisle, my heart pounding in my chest. The wedding march started to play, and I walked to the rhythm of my new life. I walked with purpose, with a fierce sense of self-worth that had been dormant for so long. My parents tried to stop me, my mother reaching out to grab my arm, but I just kept walking. The guests, sensing the drama, had all turned to watch. They were all there, the people my parents had told lies about me to. I reached the altar and stood beside Liam, who took my hand in his. His hand was warm, steady, and so comforting. The priest began to speak, but before he could get a word out, a voice boomed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special video to play for the bride and groom." It was a voice that belonged to the DJ, a young man my parents had paid to be a part of their small family lunch. He didn't know what was happening. He was just doing his job. My parents' eyes widened, their mouths dropping open in horror. They knew what was about to happen, and they knew there was nothing they could do to stop it. The moment of truth had arrived. A large screen flickered to life behind the altar, casting a harsh, artificial light on the serene stained glass windows of the cathedral. My mother's gasp was sharp and audible, and my father's face went completely slack with terror. The screen showed the video I had made in the taxi, my face pale and my eyes haunted. There was no music, no fanfare, just the raw, unedited truth. The guests, who had been whispering in hushed tones, now fell completely silent, their heads turning to the screen as if mesmerized. The video started, and my voice, though shaky, was clear and full of a terrible resolve. "This is not the wedding video you were expecting," I said. "This is a story of a different kind of ceremony, one that happened last night." I looked directly into the camera, my eyes pleading with the unseen audience. "My name is Amelia. I'm 29 years old, and last night my parents drugged me and shaved my head, all to stop me from marrying the man I love." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. My mother's mouth was a silent, gaping O of horror. My father just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if he could disappear into the polished marble. Then the video showed the most damning evidence. I took off the white headscarf and revealed my bald scalp. The crowd gasped again, a sound of shock and disbelief. Then the video switched to the footage from Sarah's phone, the videos and pictures of the storage unit. The camera panned over stacks of cash, bundles of money, bank statements showing my name and my parents' names side by side, and the forged will that made me seem like a selfish, greedy daughter. My voiceover explained every detail, the years of financial manipulation, the lies they had told to my future in-laws, the constant pressure they had put on me. I narrated my mother's cruel logic, her belief that she was saving me, her conviction that I was simply a possession she had a right to own. The video then cut to the final, emotional part, the footage I had taken on the taxi ride. It was me, holding the old worn journal, my voice breaking as I read the words of my grandmother, the truth about the cycle of abuse that had trapped my family for generations. The video explained that my parents were not just cruel, they were the products of their own broken past. The video ended and the screen went black, plunging the cathedral into a stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then a low murmur began to ripple through the crowd. The whispers turned to murmurs, the murmurs to a buzz of furious conversation. My parents were no longer the proud, triumphant people they had been moments ago. They were a pathetic, trembling sight, standing exposed in front of everyone they had ever known. Their faces were a mixture of shock, fury, and a terrible, devastating shame. They were a public spectacle, and the world was watching. The silence in the cathedral was shattered. It was a roar of voices now, a swell of outrage and shock. My mother, Eleanor, her face as white as the dress she had tried to keep me from wearing, stumbled back a step. The smugness that had defined her expression for the last 24 hours was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. My father, who had been a silent accomplice his entire life, simply sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He wasn't crying for me, he was crying for himself, for the life he had chosen to live, for the consequences he had finally been forced to face. The people my parents had so desperately wanted to impress, the guests they had so carefully curated, were now looking at them with disgust and pity. The tables had turned, the hunter had become the prey. Liam's hand was still wrapped around mine, a solid anchor in the storm. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. He just squeezed my hand, a silent gesture that said everything. The priest, his face a mixture of shock and compassion, walked over to my parents, who were now the center of a murmuring crowd. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice low and full of disappointment. My mother, her composure completely shattered, could only stammer. We were saving her. But her words were lost in the sea of angry voices. My parents were no longer the powerful, controlling figures who had ruled my life. They were a pathetic, trembling sight, standing exposed in front of everyone they had ever known. Their faces were a mixture of shock, fury, and a terrible, devastating shame. They had sought to humiliate me publicly, to strip me of my dignity, and in doing so, they had brought about their own spectacular and public downfall. The room, which had been set up for my wedding, was now the scene of their reckoning. Suddenly, Liam's father, a tall and imposing man, stepped forward, his face etched with concern. He didn't look at my parents. He looked at me, at my tear-stained face, at my head, still covered by the scarf. He put a hand on Liam's shoulder and said, "We don't need a ceremony to know what's right. Liam, you do what you need to do." Liam didn't hesitate. He turned to me and, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "Amelia, I love you. And no one, not even your parents, can change that. This isn't just a wedding, it's a promise." The reversal was complete. I was no longer the victim. I was the victor. My parents, who had sought to keep me a child, were now the ones who were a public spectacle. The power dynamic had shifted completely. They had lost everything they had so desperately tried to protect. Their reputation, their social standing, and any hope of a relationship with me. The tremor I had felt just moments before had now transferred to them. They were the ones who were shaking. The silence in the cathedral was finally broken by the sound of sirens in the distance. My parents, still trembling, looked up, their faces etched with a new kind of fear. The police arrived and were met by Sarah, who had come to the cathedral with a stack of documents and a USB drive. My mother, Eleanor, her face a mask of defeat, could only watch as the police calmly and professionally read her and my father their rights. The cameras flashed, the news reporters, who had been informed by a mysterious tip, swarmed the cathedral, and my parents were led away in handcuffs. The spectacle was complete. Their greed, their cruelty, and their carefully constructed web of lies had come crashing down in a public, humiliating display. The wedding, as it was originally planned, didn't happen that day. It didn't need to. The ceremony had already taken place. It was a ceremony of truth, a ceremony of freedom, a ceremony of justice. Liam and I stood there holding hands, surrounded by a crowd of people who had come to a wedding but had witnessed a revolution. The guests, who had been so confused just moments ago, now surrounded us, offering their support and their love. Liam's family, especially his mother, embraced me, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and compassion. They had seen the truth, and they had chosen to stand by me. My father, in a last-ditch effort to save himself, had made a deal with the police. He would testify against my mother, revealing the full extent of their financial fraud and the web of lies they had spun. He would go to prison, but for a shorter sentence. My mother, who had been the mastermind behind it all, would face the full weight of the law. They had both lost everything, their freedom, their reputation, and their relationship with their daughter. The money they had stolen from me was recovered, but the most important thing I had gained was not money. It was peace. The last scene is me a few months later. My hair has started to grow back, a soft, fuzzy buzz cut that I have come to love. It is a symbol of my new life, a visible reminder of the day I was broken and a testament to the fact that I had been strong enough to put myself back together. I am sitting in my new home with Liam, a home we chose together, a home where there are no secrets, no lies, and no manipulation. I look at my reflection in the mirror and I no longer see a victim. I see a survivor. I see a woman who was pushed to the brink and found the strength to push back. The moral of the story is simple, and it's a lesson I will never forget. Some people try to control you by holding you back. The moment you let go, you realize the only person who was ever really trapped was them.